If we are going to effectively preach through the upper room discourse, we must understand the context in which Jesus spoke these words. The context, of course, is the last night that Jesus spent on earth before his crucifixion. We assume that we know the context, and so often we fail to analyze it well. Our assumption that we know the background is often one of the major dangers in expository preaching because we don't dig deeper into the history. Assumption becomes the enemy of exegesis. If we want our preaching to have biblical and historical depth, we will have to do effective contextual analysis. We want our preaching to exude a sense of authenticity, not only to our world, but to the world of the Bible. So there are several significant contextual issues that we face as we study John chapters 13 through 17. Paul tells us that Jesus celebrated his Last Supper on the night in which he was betrayed, 1 Corinthians 11:23. All four of the Gospels tell us that Jesus celebrated his Last Supper and then went to Gethsemane, where he was betrayed by Judas. However, John, in his Gospel, adds some important elements. John adds the foot washing, much more of Jesus' teaching is included, and he never mentions the institution of what we call the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, which is so important to all the other gospel writers and to the Apostle Paul. One of the major historical matters we must address before preaching through the upper room discourse is the chronology of the last night as it relates to John's summary of Jesus' teachings. Why did he write what he wrote and leave out what he left out? How do we mesh the synoptic accounts and John's account to give us the contextual background for our preaching? We as preachers must decide several significant exegetical issues before we can accurately preach the text. In order to do that, we start by asking, what day of the week was Jesus crucified? One view is that he was crucified on Wednesday. This view is not widely held. A few, like W. Graham Scroggie, have argued for Wednesday based upon a literal interpretation of Matthew 12:40, where Jesus said, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." According to this view, Jesus had to have been buried for the full 72 hours. However, when you factor in a sunset to sunset reckoning of days, then Sunday would have been the 4th day since his death. We know that Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week, Sunday, and not on Saturday. John chapter 20, verse 1, Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 all say that. Furthermore, other texts tell us that Jesus rose again on the 3rd day after his crucifixion. It is well established that the Jews counted part of a day as the whole day. So it's not necessary to have a full 72-hour period of time. It can be understood idiomatically as taking place on the 3rd day by counting any part of a day as one day. How about the Thursday view? A common view, popularized by James Montgomery Boyce and others, is that Jesus was crucified on Thursday. In this view, the 15th of Nisan, the first day of unleavened bread, fell on a Friday, meaning that the Jewish calendar had 2 Sabbaths that year, a high Sabbath, Passover Sabbath, and a regular Sabbath on Saturday. The day of preparation, the 14th of Nisan, was Thursday when Jesus was crucified. This means that Jesus ate the Last Supper on Wednesday night. There are several arguments in support of this view. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40 Jesus would be buried then for 3 full nights and 2 full days, plus a partial day, making it 3 days and 3 nights. The argument is that a Friday crucifixion can be 3 days, 2 partial days, but not 3 nights. Therefore, a crucifixion on Friday cannot fulfill the full prophecy of Matthew 12:40. John 19:31, the Sabbath was called a high day, meaning that it was a special Sabbath, not the regular weekly Sabbath. Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation when the lambs were being slain prior to the start of Passover at sunset. Matthew 28, verse 1. The word for Sabbath in this verse is plural, so it should read after the Sabbaths, indicating a double Sabbath in the year that Jesus died. The 14th of Nisan, the day of preparation, did not fall on a Friday between the years of AD 26 and AD 33, according to the historical calendars. But it did fall on Thursday, AD 30, which fits the timeline of Jesus well. The crucifixion took place, according to James Montgomery Boyce, then, on April 6th, AD 30. Let's take a look at this view. This view solves the problem of Matthew 12:40 and the 3 days and 3 nights allowing Jesus to be in the tomb for 3 full nights. However, that means that Jesus was raised actually from the dead on the 4th day, because after 3 nights requires a 4th day. There is no historical evidence to suggest that the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Passover or unleavened bread, was considered a Sabbath. Obviously, it was a holy day for Israel, but there's no evidence that they considered it a Sabbath on which no one could work. The day of preparation in normal usage referred to the day before the regular weekly Sabbath, according to Josephus, the Jewish historian, and several texts of Scripture. In John chapter 19, verse 14, John writes about the day of preparation for the Passover. But then John 19:31 seems to favor the day of preparation as the Friday before the weekly Sabbath. That Sabbath, he says, unless you interpret high Sabbath as meaning a double Sabbath. High Sabbath does not necessarily mean a double Sabbath, since there's no evidence that Passover was considered a Sabbath. It could just as well mean that the regular Sabbath was high or special because Passover fell on that day that year. Matthew 28, verse 1, does use a plural noun for Sabbath. However, Sabbath is frequently used in the plural for emphasis, even though it refers to a single Sabbath. Over 1/3 of the occurrences of Sabbath in the New Testament are in the plural form. Therefore, we cannot argue that this means that there were multiple Sabbaths that weekend. What about the traditional Friday view? Good Friday, as the day of crucifixion, is the most widely accepted view down through history. Jesus died on the day of preparation for the Sabbath, for the Passover, and was put in the tomb. The women went home for the Passover and returned early on the first day of the week, that would be Sunday morning, to find the tomb empty. A Friday crucifixion has been the consensus of the Church Fathers and many scholars down through history. The one problem with the view is, of course, Matthew 12:40 again, where the prediction is for 3 days and 3 nights. If taken literally, then obviously Friday as the day of crucifixion is eliminated. However, if taken idiomatically, then it is not insurmountable as an argument. The problem for taking it literally is that Jesus would then have to be raised again on the 4th day in order to get 3 full nights. And that's a problem for the Thursday view as well as the Friday view. The natural reading of the Gospels would say that Jesus was raised again on the third day, meaning only 2 nights. And this is my view, but you as a preacher will have to decide how you will handle the data. Jesus frequently predicted that he would be raised on the third day. He said he would be raised up in 3 days in John 2:19 through 22. The biblical record states that Jesus rose again on the third day, not after 3 days. That would be Acts 10:40 and 1 Corinthians 15:4. For example, the disciples on the road to Emmaus said it was the third day, Luke 24:21. The Pharisees asked for a guard to be posted until the third day. They didn't ask for the guard to be posted until the 4th day, Matthew 27:64. There are, however, 4 passages that speak of Christ's resurrection after 3 days. But in each case, the context or a parallel passage specifies that it is on the 3rd day. You can check it out, Matthew 8:31, and compare Matthew 16:21 and Luke 9:22. Another one is Mark 9:31, compared with Matthew 17:23. We have Mark 10:34 compared with Matthew 20 verse 19 and Luke 18:33. And then there is Matthew 27:63. But that is qualified by the request for the soldiers until the 3rd day, Matthew 27:64. There is ample Jewish and Old Testament evidence that part of a day was treated as a day. For example, Esther asks the people not to drink or eat for 3 days, night and day, Esther 4:16, but then goes into the king on the 3rd day, Esther 5:1. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, AD 100, said these words, "A day and a night are an ona, a portion of time, and the portion of an ona is as the whole of it." I conclude that Jesus died on Friday. The upper room discourse took place on Thursday evening as they ate the Last Supper together. Now, as preachers, of course, you will not preach all of this material. Most of it will end up in the cutting room floor. This information provides depth and color to your preaching. It may come out in bits and pieces, sort of like color commentary fitted into the sermon as you preach to the people, helping people to visualize the setting for the verses that you are covering. Here's another question. Was the Last Supper a Passover meal? God gave Israel the instructions for Passover when they were leaving Egypt in Exodus 12, Leviticus 23, Numbers 9, Deuteronomy 16. The instructions said that on the 10th of Nisan, which is March-April period, the family selected a lamb for the feast, Exodus 12:3. On the 14th of Nisan, they killed the lamb between the 2 evenings, Exodus 12:6 and Leviticus 23:5, which Josephus, the historian, tells us was between the 9th and 11th hours, or in our terms, between 3 and 5 p.m. Then they ate the meal that night, Exodus 12:8. It is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread because all leaven was removed from the home on the first day of the celebration, and the festival lasted for 7 days, Exodus 12:15. So did Jesus celebrate the Passover in the upper room that night? The Synoptic Gospels make clear that the Last Supper was a celebration of the Passover. Jesus intended to eat the Passover with his disciples that night, according to the Synoptics. However, John, in his gospel, seems to say very clearly that Jesus did not eat the Passover. The upper room discourse begins in John chapter 13, verse 1, with the words, before the feast of the Passover, and goes on to talk about during supper that night. Furthermore, during the trial of Jesus, John tells us that the priests would not enter the praetorium, quote, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. John 18:28, meaning that they had not yet eaten the Passover. John paints the picture that Jesus was crucified at the time the Passover lambs were sacrificed, the day of preparation, thus making Jesus our Passover lamb. John connects the death of Christ closely with what came to be called Passover theology throughout his gospel. Paul also states that Christ, our Passover, has also been sacrificed. If Jesus was crucified at the time of the killing of the lambs, then he could not have eaten the Passover the night before the killing of the lambs. So which is it? Did Jesus eat the Passover, or was he our Passover lamb? A historic split occurred in the 2nd century between the Greek and Latin parts of the early church over this very issue. The Greek churches held the position that Jesus did not eat the Passover, but instead was our Passover lamb, replacing what they considered to be Jewish theology with Christian theology. The Latin churches, on the other hand, held that Jesus ate the Passover and did not see it as a theological problem for them. You will have to decide between 3 general positions in order to preach the upper room discourse in all its fullness and color. The positions are yes, no, and yes and no. Those are your exegetical options. First, yes, Jesus ate the Passover with his disciples. The Synoptic Gospels explicitly state that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. In fact, Jesus states that he wanted to eat the Passover with them before he suffered, Luke 22:15. Many features in a typical Passover are also part of the events that night. It was eaten within the gates of Jerusalem in accord with Deuteronomy 16:7, and at night, which was not the normal time for a meal. The disciples assumed that Judas was leaving to give an offering to the poor, which was a normal part of Passover night, John 13:29. The Last Supper ended with the singing of a hymn, and it was customary in Passover to sing the Hallel, Psalms 115 to 118, at the close of the meal. And at the close of this meal, they sang a hymn and departed, 1 Corinthians, Matthew 26:30 and Mark 14:26. The cup of blessing was part of the Passover meal, and the Last Supper, in the Passover, it would have been the 3rd cup. So the cup in the Passover, in the Last Supper, would have been the 3rd cup. 1 Corinthians 10:16, Matthew 26:27. The interpretation of the elements was a big part of the Passover meal. They would teach people through the enacting of the Passover. And Jesus interprets the events of the supper that last night for his disciples in a similar way. Secondly, the answer could be no. Jesus did not eat the Passover with his disciples. He ate a celebration meal early because he anticipated his death on the cross. Some suggest that it was a kiddush, or religious meal, eaten on the eve of the Sabbath, which included a blessing over the bread and cup. However, these elements in Jewish tradition are all post-Christian and are never done 24 hours before the Sabbath. John's order of events implies that the meal was not the Passover, John 13:1. Some thought Judas was leaving to buy what was needed for the feast, John 13:29. There is no mention of a lamb anywhere in the accounts of the Last Supper, nor that they used unleavened bread. When Jesus was dying on the cross, John tells us that it was the day of preparation for the Passover, John 19, verse 14, indicating again that it was the time when the lambs were sacrificed. Jesus died then when the Passover lambs were sacrificed, meaning that he could not have eaten the Passover meal the night before. Those are the arguments in support of no. The third position is yes and no. Jesus ate the Passover meal, but also died before the Passover meal. Jesus ate the Passover meal with his disciples and died on the cross before the eating of the Passover meal because the lambs were sacrificed on 2 consecutive days in the first century. Some argue that there is historical data to suggest that the Pharisees and Sadducees counted their calendar differently based on a dispute over when Nisan started. However, the more common harmonization deals with 2 ways to reckon the days. At this time, the Galileans and the Pharisees, and of course the disciples were almost all Galileans, were using a sunrise to sunrise reckoning, while the Judeans and Sadducees used a sunset to sunset calendar. The Synoptics treat it as a Passover meal following sunrise to sunrise, while John views the events from the timetable of the Sadducees, who were in charge of the temple and used a sunset to sunset reckoning. There is some practical support for 2 days of slaughter, given the number of lambs that had to be slaughtered for Passover by the first century. In this way, Jesus could eat the Passover and be crucified as the Passover lamb. You, as the preacher, must decide how you will handle that material. No one can be dogmatic about it, and we all must come to grips with the differences between John and the Synoptics on the details of this last night.